Our first speaker is Monica Peters, and it's my pleasure to introduce her. I've worked with Monica about 7 or 8 years ago on producing a wetland restoration handbook, and since then she's completed a PhD on community-led environmental restoration, and she has also become a leader in citizen science, and her talk today is on citizen science for conservation. Okay, thanks, Monica.
Great, thanks, Bev. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, lots of nods. So, who's a scientist here? Cool. So this is what you guys look like. You know, when Sandy Leopold the other day did a search for eradication and came up with all of those wonderful heavy metal images, I thought I'd do a bit of a search for scientist and just see what Google Images comes up with. So this is how society sees you. A bunch of people wearing white coats, staring really meaningfully at test tubes. And you guys all do this, right? It's a bit different when you look up citizen scientist. It actually looks like people are having fun. It looks like people are actually out there doing stuff in the environment. So I'm going to talk to you today about citizen science. I'm going to spend the first part of my talk just briefly defining what citizen science is. And then I'll give you a rundown of the diversity of projects that are underway in New Zealand at the moment. And I'll spend the second half of my talk going over some of the suggestions that have come up and the work that I've been doing over the last year about how we can do better in this space, what we need to do to take citizen science forward in New Zealand. So, does everybody know what citizen science is? Yeah? Okay, great. I guess I put this question forward because there seems to be a lack of definitions out there, and I'm seeing citizen science, that term, used more and more and more. Like I, out of curiosity, went through the Ministry for the Environment's Conservation and Environmental Science roadmap, and I counted the word citizen science 9 times with no definition whatsoever. Isn't that quite interesting? Often when you see the term citizen science, you might think it's something like this. So this is a fairly common definition of what citizen science is. We've got data in there, we've got knowledge building in there, and we've got some learning happening in there as well, and supporting evidence-based decision making. But when you do like a word search for citizen science, you also see that there's a whole bunch of philosophies in there. And I guess my definition of citizen science is science with a bit more heart to it, science that's in a broader social context. So just have a look at some of those words there, because it's a different way of doing science, and it's one that I think is really, really exciting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what citizen science is good for. I mean, everybody has opinions on that, but there's just 2 things that I want to highlight here. And one is discovery. Citizen science can lead to some really interesting discoveries, and there's a few examples in New Zealand around what has turned up at Biobullets. A new species of intertidal spider. This crazy spider lives in an area where the waves come up, and it burrows into the sandstone and it creates a little cover on top of its hole, and it just comes out when the tide is low enough to do its feeding. And this was discovered in a Biobullets in Uretara that was run over in the Katikati area last year sometime. And then also citizen science I think is really great for sparking innovation. And one example that I want to bring up here is a sensor that's being developed for water quality. And this is happening in the Wairarapa. A farmer, unhappy with water quality in his area, has developed a cheap tool. It's about the size of a loaf of bread, and it's got sensors on there, and you can put this tool into water and leave it there for about 5 days, and it will collect data at 10-minute intervals. And the cool thing about this tool is that it can be picked up and used by communities, and it costs just a couple of $1,000s. So that'll be rolled out later this year. So these are just 2 things that I think citizen science is really good for: innovation and discovery. And there's plenty more. One of the jobs I did last year was to bring together an inventory of citizen science in New Zealand. And it's by no means complete. It's really hard to find out what is actually happening in this space. So this particular report that I brought together for the New Zealand Landcare Trust as a part of a citizen science meets environmental restoration project that I've been involved with brings together like a whole cross-section of different projects. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through those now. We've got a bunch of projects in there that deal with collecting data on single species, getting a handle on population numbers and distribution. And a really good example of this is the Great Kereru Count, and that'll be coming up this year. So it's an annual bird count. What we don't see so much of, and what might be a little bit surprising, is projects that have a climate change focus. And one of the ones that I thought was quite interesting is part of a global initiative. And what people do is they take photographs of the extent of the king tides. And there's an Auckland branch of this. And I think that this has some really interesting applications for coastal restoration projects, you know, looking in the future as what kind of species might be planted and so forth. What we perhaps don't have so much of in New Zealand is citizen science with a whole ecosystem health focus. And I've put this beautiful picture of a wetland up here. This actually used to be a paddock, so pretty impressive. And one of the tools that I've been involved with is the Wetlands Monitoring and Assessment Kit. This was a project that I did while I was at the New Zealand Landcare Trust and got a fantastic ecologist on board to help with the technical aspects of this project. So we do have the tools out there to help community environmental groups measure the health of ecosystems, but I don't think we're seeing a lot of data coming out for those types of projects. You know, equally, we also have an enormous amount of cultural health indices as well. And so there's this really big overlap between citizen science and mātauranga Māori. And I'm not going to go into that so much here because I think it's an area that we need to kind of tease out a little bit more. There's something that we need to have more conversations about. Having more conversations has very much been a whole theme of this conference. Another way to look at citizen science is to question how the public are actually involved, you know, and at the same time you can ask whose monitoring agenda is it? So in some projects there's a lot of public involvement in all aspects of the scientific process, asking the question, designing the study, collecting the data, and reporting and sharing the findings. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got professional involvement. And some projects slide more towards that end of the spectrum. You have professionals essentially who are running the projects, and the role of the public is primarily just to collect data. So you might call these crowdsourced projects, you might call them contributory projects. There's a whole bunch of different terminology out there that I won't get into that much. But the reality is that a lot of projects kind of sit in that middle ground. They're sort of operating in that hybrid space. And I'll talk a little bit more about this over the next few slides. When we're looking at that kind of contributory end of the thing, we've got a whole lot of Biobullets projects that are happening. This has really captured the public imagination in New Zealand. We've had more than 20 Bioblitzes around the place. And they've been run by science institutes, they've been run by museums, and they've also been run by community groups themselves. And I'm really interested to see the findings of the Blitz Me. I hope you've all done the Blitz Me thing. Have you done that? Great, good. And yeah, so a lot of Bioblitzes have happened and some really interesting findings there in terms of identifying species that previously weren't recorded in places, but also identifying what species weren't found, so gaps in species assemblages in specific places. Great public engagement tool. This next lot of tools are also around kind of crowdsourcing, the crowdsourcing end of the spectrum. And I've picked a a cross-section of projects here. And the first one is Beach Patrol, and you could say, arguably, that the Ornithological Society of New Zealand are leaders in the citizen science space. They've been going out there collecting data for many decades now and doing a great job of that. And one of their crazy projects is to go and just walk along the beach and see the dead things that have washed up on our shores. At the other end of the technological spectrum, we've got the use of apps and camera traps. So Identify Animals is a cool project here run through Victoria University. And this is a different kind of way of getting involved in a citizen science project, because it doesn't involve getting out there, tramping along beaches and looking at dead stuff or picking up a spade or doing any outside measurements. It is identifying which animals appear on video footage. So a kind of, I guess, a passive way of getting involved in a citizen science project. And there's a whole range of apps now as well that have been developed for people to log their species observations. And it might be for specific species, like Maui's dolphin, or it might be for a whole range of different biota, flora, fauna, and fungi, like on the Nature Watch website. Does anybody use Nature Watch here? Oh yeah, okay, great. I want to put community group-led monitoring kind of in that hybrid end of the spectrum, and perhaps also down that community-led end of the spectrum, because some groups out there have that professional expertise within their groups. They're designing their science projects, they're doing the research, and they're sharing the findings themselves, but often it's more of a partnership type arrangement. And this might be one of the biggest areas of citizen science that we have happening in New Zealand, because in my studies of nearly 300 community environmental groups, there's a surprising number that actually do monitoring in some shape or form. So what do we do well? At the moment, we do have funding for citizen science in a kind of a limited sort of a way, I will add. And this is through the Nation of Curious Minds. I mean, this strategy is very much about creating a society that is scientifically literate. It has a strong educational focus, and there's been some really beautiful creative projects and collaborations that have come out of the funding that is available through the Curious Minds strategy, through the Participatory Science platform. But what it lacks, and what we lack in general, is tools to help groups collect long-term environmental data. I mean, this happens anyway. This is Mana Island on Saturday last week. And I had an opportunity to go out there, and I spent the whole day talking with volunteers, friends of Mana Island, and it was really fantastic to see what they're doing out there and the kind of data they're collecting. I mean, groups like this have been around for a very long time, and some of these groups have been collecting data for a very long time as well. But it's also interesting that despite the amount of community environmental groups, despite the whole momentum in this citizen science space, we still have a society that acknowledges that we do have problems with freshwater, but they tend to think that most of our terrestrial ecosystems are actually pretty good, that we're actually doing okay. I mean, you'll have seen this quote come up in at least 2 talks over the last couple of days. So for the last half of my talk, I just want to talk about what we could do better. And this isn't just my personal opinion, the results of my research. This is getting out there and talking to probably around 200 people. So I've been running workshops through the New Zealand Landcare Trust project that I mentioned before. I've also run some independently, and I've also run some through other trusts as well. And we've run these projects. This is at Landcare Research in Palmerston North. This is at a wānanga up in Lee. And we've engaged a whole range of different people. So we have members of the community. We have people who are involved in community education. We have people who are scientists. We have people who are project coordinators. So a big cross-section of people putting their thoughts out there as to what are the challenges and what are the solutions for citizen science. So I'm going to share some of those with you. We've also run a bunch of tours through the New Zealand Landcare Trust project. And again, we've had probably about 40 people involved in these tours and looked at least a dozen projects. And this has been a way of encouraging further dialogue, but in situ. So looking at specific projects. This is the Otago Peninsula Biodiversity Group. That's part of the Predator-Free Initiative for the Otago Peninsula. We had the joy of being there last week, talking to this group and finding out what about the science that they're doing. And again, coming back to the roadmap, you're getting lots of kind of quite vague sentences like that. And I guess the reality is that the roadmap is just it's like a what document. It's like what could happen. It's not a how document. We're a bit low on how these sorts of things should happen, but I'll argue that citizen science already does play a major role. And I'm just going to leave out the mātauranga part, because like I said before, we need to kind of get our heads a little bit more around that space, about that relationship between citizen science and mātauranga Māori. 5 things come up out of those workshops and out of those tours: centralisation, motivation, diversity, data use and evaluation. So I'll just go through those now. The first thing, building information hubs. Where do you go to get information on citizen science in New Zealand? When you look at community environmental restoration, we've got some amazing databases there. This is trap.nz. There are over 440 groups now on the trap.nz database. Talk to Peter Hanford, he can give you more of a rundown than I can. And this is really fantastic because we need this information to start quantifying what community groups actually achieve as far as conservation effort is concerned. So we've got lots happening there. We've got trap.nz, we've got Nature Space, we've got a whole bunch of tools there. But we don't really have much at that citizen science database end of things, like that hub for projects. Yeah, you've got the inventory that I wrote, the PDF. That's kind of getting a little bit old-fashioned, a PDF, really? We don't have a website or anything like that. And one of the suggestions came up in the workshop that we should have maybe a Tinder for citizen science projects. Imagine that. The projects would come up and you'd look on your phone and you go, nah. Oh, yeah. I quite like that idea, a bit crazy. Motivation. This is a big one because we have so much going on in this space, and how do we keep people enthused in projects, particularly as projects mature? Sure, we have a lot of fantastic volunteers out there who will put their hearts, their minds, their bodies, their souls into these projects, but how do you keep them inspired? And it's interesting when you look at technology and the different ways that you need to build motivation when people are using online tools. I mean, just imagine how many data points would have been collected if people were collecting environmental data while using Pokemon Go. And there's been a report that was put out, Motivations for Citizen Science, brought out last year through the UK Environmental Observation Framework. So that has some good pointers in there that I can't really go into in too much detail now, but definitely an interesting report to read. Diversity. When we look particularly at community environmental groups, we see a lot of retired folk. I mean, they're the backbone of environmental restoration, and they're obviously the backbone then of the people who collect environmental data, who do the citizen science component. This might surprise some of you. There are a lot of young people out there who are willing to engage. And last year I was invited to speak at the Forest and Bird Conference, and it was like a sea of grey hair. And so the presenter had grey hair as well. But they also invited along the Youth Environmental Leaders Forum, and this is a very, very dynamic group of people who are through the Sir Peter Blake Environmental Trust. And one of the big things that came out of the panel discussion that they led was that youth want to listen to youth. And so if we want to broaden the diversity, then we need to start bringing youth on in leadership roles. And so maybe we want to bring youth into organisations like onto the board of Forest and Bird. Maybe we want to encourage those intergenerational dialogues to get youth to respect the knowledge and the experience that these elders have and to break down, I guess, the barriers that elders might have towards these young upstarts, and to respect the different ways that each operates. The fourth point I want to make is around data use. Because in the end, we know that community environmental groups collect enormous amounts of data, trapping data, bird numbers, and on plants as well. You know, a lot of groups are out there doing transects and so forth. But what do we do with these data? We don't actually do a lot with them at this point. I think that Predator-Free New Zealand is fantastic because it creates an opportunity to make better use of communities trapping data. But I think we can do better than that, and I can think we can think more broadly about that. I'd like to eventually see something like this. This is the Open Laboratories in the UK. This is a partnership between the Natural History Museum of London and a whole bunch of different educational institutes around citizen science. It's a very powerful, long-running, well-supported program, and they brought out this community environment report. Hey, you know what? We could do that too, because if we thought a little bit more clearly, we could use those data more effectively that community groups already generate. The last thing is evaluation, because we need to know that the citizen science that we are doing is actually effective. And I'm not going to talk about the environmental outcomes, I'm going to talk about the social outcomes. Here's a little quote I picked off Facebook, the 1080 Eyewitness page. If you want to have a good laugh and simultaneously terrify yourself, go and have a look at these guys' Facebook page. So there's a huge role there for citizen science to enhance the ecological literacy and the scientific literacy of the wider community, and quite possibly even help people like this with their terrible grammar. Because, you know, we want our youth to grow up. These are our future decision makers. We want them to grow up with those skills and with that knowledge to basically help us manage New Zealand better. So to wrap up, this is my vision, if you like, that citizen science isn't just a nice to have. It's not a nice thing on the side, just something that kind of gets used when, gosh, we don't have any money, we need to get some volunteers, let's just kind of dream up a citizen science project and get some free labour. Let's actually see it as something that is meaningful, that is valid, that is a good way of doing a specific type of research to answer a specific type of question. And that can provide us with really meaningful data. And I've added in there reciprocal education and engagement, because engagement is something that has been talked about a lot over the last couple of days. So it's not only about the people who are involved, like your community participants, learning. It's about the people who are working with them, the scientists, the agencies, the other professionals learning as well. So you guys can decide whether that's ambitious or just plain crazy. Thanks.
Thanks, Monica. And right on time. Monica talks about invites to the conversation this time for some questions.
Well, I don't have a question, I just have a comment. This is the best talk I've seen of all these 3 days.
Oh,
thank you very
Great.
much.
Cool.
It's really inspiring. Thank you very much.
Monica, can you give us an example of measuring the social outcomes of citizen science?
That's quite tough to actually do, because I think you need to have, I guess, a specific set of questions. You know, what are you actually measuring there? And I think when I talked to the people at Auckland Museum who were running a Biobullets just a few weeks ago, we included them as a part of our tour up in Auckland. We had a panel and we talked a little bit about this. They just did not have the funding or the social science expertise to bring somebody in to answer those questions. But I came across one single report on the internet about how you might evaluate a BioBlitz, and this is student work, and it was about capturing anecdotes from people walking around. It was about doing observations. It was about having focus groups. So it was quite an unstructured way of doing that because it was trying to capture what was happening at the BioBlitz as it was actually going on. But that was a full role for a researcher. So it was one person who was charged with doing that. And for a lot of projects, it's like that's one person too many. That's one person that there isn't resourcing for. Yeah.
Hi, you did really well. That was a lovely speech. That wasn't meant to sound as patronising as it did. I am so sold on the social outcomes, but I'm not convinced by the scientific outcomes of a lot of citizen science because there is a lot of engagement by scientists or the leaders of, we're talking in the non-community-led end of it, I'm here. There's a lot of time spent, a lot of resources spent on actually trying to keep that data in high quality. I've tried to work with citizen data myself and ended up throwing it all out. Not that they did it specifically for me, but I just could not use it for the purpose that I needed because it wasn't consistent. Different groups had done different things at different times. What is your answer to that insofar as scientists don't have the resources to control, or not control, but do good science?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the end, it comes down to the type of question that you're answering, that you're trying to answer. You know, is it something that's quite general? What is the level of quality of data that you actually need? I draw a great deal of inspiration from projects that I see overseas because, I mean, I don't know how many citizen science projects there are out there, but there are a significant quantity. And a lot of the data has actually been published. And, you know, when I look at those projects and, you know, you ask yourself, it's like, okay, well, how did they do that? You know, often it's quite simple. Like they might set up, you know, firstly, you're making sure that the question that you're asking is appropriate for a community group. You're providing, or community level people, you are asking whether the tools or the equipment that they're using is appropriate for them and how much training people actually need to use those tools effectively. And what I'm also seeing in projects is inserting little tests. So if it's about species identification, giving people a little test and saying, okay, well, you know, can you accurately identify the key species that we are working with? And based on what people's responses are, you might give them like a high grade or a low grade, which then helps you to analyse those data in a specific way. So there are kind of key points in the whole data collection, analysis and reporting cycle that you can insert those kind of quality assurance and quality control points in there. But I do agree that if you want to get good quality data, then you have to put the effort in there, that it has to actually be resourced. It's not going to happen by itself because something might require ongoing training. It might require somebody to be there to answer those technical questions. You know, do I put my tape measure through the flax bush or around the flax bush? Things like that.
Time for one more quick question.
Thank you.
Hi Monica, great talk as always. I always find that citizen science is viewed quite patronisingly by a lot of people. It's seen as a thing that you get and you definitely need, but you definitely don't have to pay for. And I think the real next step for it is finding a way to resource it, finding a way to recognise it and give it institutional recognition. And I'm just wondering if you have ideas on how you might give institutional recognition to citizen science so that it becomes something people are willing to pay for and recognise the value of. Because as much as we might degrade it, the reality is some of our longest data sets come from community-led data collection like Birds NZ. They don't come from scientists, actually. So just interested in your thoughts on how to expand the field.
Sure. What I've noticed in the last 2 years, it's only been 2 years, that There's been developments in associations. There's the Citizen Science Association of America. There's the Citizen Science Association of Europe. There's now one in Australia as well. And when I look at who the partners are on those organisations, it is universities, it is museums. So these are institutes that are leading those particular projects, and obviously they have partnerships with all manner of other institutions. And we don't have that kind of leadership at this stage in New Zealand. Nobody's really put up their hand and said, okay, yeah, we're going to be the lead organisation to drive citizen science in New Zealand and to find ways of resourcing it and to build policy around making it happen.